Is the world truly united? Well, different countries, different cultures, different geographical locations, different laws, different regimes, different agendas to maintain their own sovereign states. So with all these differences, is the world united? Well, there are some who firmly believe that the world is indeed united. Who are they? What do they do? Have they met with success in their efforts? Well, in Diplomatic Faces today, we focus on the Israeli ambassador to Sri Lanka, His Excellency Naor Gilong. Ayubovan, Your Excellency.
Hi, good evening.
Well, first and foremost, we'd like to say thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be our diplomatic face for today.
My pleasure.
Let's begin with you just briefly telling us about yourself.
Wow. Okay. I'm a veteran diplomat of 32 years, more or less. I joined the ministry a long time ago, and I've served in mostly in Europe and the United States. I've been ambassador. It's my third ambassadorship. I've been ambassador to Italy, then to the Netherlands, and now in India with also Sri Lanka and Bhutan under my kingdom, we should call it. And I've done in Israel, in between interesting jobs, I've worked with three prime ministers as the deputy foreign policy advisor. I've been the chief of staff of a minister of foreign affairs, and I had the responsibility, deputy director general with responsibility to Europe and the European Union. So I've done a lot. Asia is new for me.
Well, that can be quite challenging, isn't it? But what motivated you to get into diplomatic service in the first place?
I think it was by coincidence in a way, because I didn't know what I want to do, and I had an uncle who was an ambassador to, by the way, Singapore, and he was also here, but it was not on my radar, as you would say. I studied in university, and a friend, a colleague in university, told me, why don't we go to the cadets course tests? And I was not too optimistic, because the numbers in my time, we were 1,500 candidates and 15 were received, so 1 out of 100. So I went there with not too high expectations. And one thing led to the other. I found myself in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Wow, that's quite an accomplishment. And you did mention, though, that you were in Europe, but Asia is new. Now, what would you say were the most significant challenges that probably you, your family, had to face when, you keep traveling around and taking up these different assignments?
Yeah, of course, in general, the diplomatic life is very challenging. We have 4 children, and it's always a challenge with the kids, with the movements. Academically, socially, luckily our kids are very good in studying, so this academic side was never a problem when we went abroad or came back to Israel. The social side, in certain ages, is a little bit more complicated. When they are teenagers, it's more demanding on them, because this is the time that you create the friendships. But in general, I think that all my kids weathered this storm quite well, and remember it fondly, probably their way of living.
So it's a collective effort, isn't it?
Yes, it's a family affair, it's a family mission. We call it a mission. We don't call it a job, or especially for an Israeli diplomat. It's very, very challenging. We are always in minority and under diplomatic attack wherever we are. But it's a family affair, because your spouse has to be part of the work. Every diplomat, by the way, especially head of mission, ambassadors, the spouses, because hosting is part of it and going to events is part of it. So it's a family affairs, but also the kids. By the way, they go to schools where they are supposed, in the eyes of their surroundings, represent Israel. So if there is an issue now happening in Israel, they're expected to explain to the public, and Israel is always in the news, so explain to the peers, to their teachers, what's happening, what is the position. So it is a real family affair for every diplomat, more so, I think, for an Israeli one.
All right, so which means that all of you have to have that firm belief that what you're doing is actually worth the effort and that it will be met with success. Am I right?
Yes. You know, the kids, you don't really ask them. The spouse is more important. Also, the spouse is usually the one that would sacrifice, in a way, her or his own career. Because it's very hard to maintain a stable career when the family goes in and out of Israel every 3, 4 years, 2 years, depends on what you do. So it's very hard. It's a family decision, and you have to have conviction. For Israel, it's easy, I think, having a conviction, because what we do has value and is part of the protection of Israel. There is the protection through military, and we are a country where military service is compulsory, and people do that voluntarily. So they are, I mean, of course they complain when they're under military, but when they look back, they're very happy, because we understand it's a necessity to protect our country. And I think that I see, at least the way I see my mission as a diplomat abroad, is to continue the national security of Israel, because diplomacy is part of the national security. It's not only holding a weapon and protecting your country.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the country, it's interesting that both Israel and Sri Lanka gained independence in the year 1948. Now, since then, how would you say both countries have progressed as independent states, and what have their contribution been to the world scene?
So I rather speak about Israel and can say what we did. When Israel started, we were in 48, when the War of Independence broke, when Israel was attacked by neighboring countries, we were 600,000 people in Israel, many of them Holocaust survivors, so people who were really after a trauma. We're speaking 3 years after the Holocaust, including my father, for example, who came a year after the establishment of Israel, but was part of it. So it was a very small country, no real economic basis. We were able to survive the war and, you know, have a country because we had no alternative. After the Holocaust, you know, we couldn't see another Holocaust happening for the minority, the small group of Jews in Israel. But since the country was established, there was huge immigration towards Israel of Jews from all around, from Europe, from the Arab states. Some of them had to leave the Arab neighbors and neighboring states because they were persecuted, because now they were part of the Jewish entity who was having its own state. So as long as they were subject in Muslim countries, it was okay. But now they are part of became, after living there for 100 years, part of the enemy. So they also left as refugees and came to Israel. So the first years, it was hard. There was scarcity of food. Israel was based on agriculture. And thanks God, with the years, and especially from the 80s and 90s, the innovation, the high-tech, has become the main thing. And this is the real engine. 50% of our economy is based on innovation, high-tech. It's called a startup nation because it has the highest concentration of startups per capita in the world. Israel, we're only 9 million people with about 10,000 startups in a given time. So I think this is a strong engine. And today, Israel is one of the leading countries among OECD countries in many, many elements. And we are doing quite well, and we are good. We did it, although we had to fight for our existence again and again, but maybe also because we had to fight. We were always outnumbered. We are 9 million people, 7 million Jews today, surrounded by huge countries, and we are a country of almost about third the size of Sri Lanka. And we were surrounded by huge, huge countries with huge population. And the only way we could survive is always being a step ahead of the enemy. And I think this was a very uniting element for the Israeli public. and driving element to be innovative, although Jews also abroad, the Nobel laureates among the Jews from all over the world, not only from Israel, is disproportional to the numbers in population, because Jews always had this tendency to study and to be researchers and to do things to improve the world. And that's what we try to do in Israel too.
So coming out of the Holocaust and all that experience, there is something in common there because of the fact that Sri Lanka experienced a 30-year war as well. So how would you say Israel was, let's say, friendly, or how did Israel help Sri Lanka in Sri Lanka's battle against terror?
Yes, already in the 80s, and I met here a few veterans who are now politicians or are doing other things from the Sri Lankan military who praised the assistance of Israel in training and in the weapon systems. That, for example, the former chief of the Air Force told me that the change in the war was from the time that Israel supplied UAVs and precise ammunition, because from that time on, there was no need for heavy bombing. You could find the target and less collateral damage. You could identify the target and hit the wanted target rather than hitting too many people in order to hopefully get your target. So I think this is one element. But all over the years, there were more elements. Also, your secretary, foreign secretary, told me at the time that he was the chief of the Navy about technologies that help and weapon systems which helped Sri Lanka. So I think in general we helped and we continue helping. I will not go into details because countries don't used to share information about this type of cooperation, but it's still going on and we are here to help whenever is needed. I believe that terrorism is not an acceptable thing wherever it happens. Citizens shouldn't be killed for no reason or for a stupid reason. And I think that all the normal people of the world have to cooperate together in order to fight and combat terrorism.
Are there any mechanisms in place to strengthen bilateral defense ties between the two countries?
There is nothing organized or systemized, but there are, we do speak when needed, and we offered things and systems over the years. Sometimes they were required, sometimes they were not, but we speak regularly. Whenever the need comes up, we speak.
Speaking of bilateral ties and tracing back the relationship that both countries have had with each other, we find that there's been an on-off kind of relationship with former President J.R. Jayawardena. It was very strong, and then after that it was made null and void, and then again with next regimes, it was back and forth. How would you say the relationship is right now?
The relationship right now are good. We have to work to make them excellent. I think I had quite extensive meetings here with people speaking of how we can cooperate in many facets of life, from agriculture to water to tourism to workers in Sri Lankan workers in Israel. So we spoke on many sides, hoping to create more value into the relations. So we are trying to be friendly and helpful wherever we can, and I think that the relations. I'm very surprised, because there was a lot of admiration towards Israel in the 80s for the help, and then the relations were cut not too long after. But I guess that's politics, that's life. And now I think that my impression from the counterparts I met here from the political system, that they very much value their relations with Israel, and we have to take it to the next level.
You touched on agriculture and how Israel has state-of-the-art agricultural technology and water management and things like that. So how specifically do you think Israel can help Sri Lanka when it comes to the area of agriculture?
Yes, in India, we have for more than 20 years centers of excellence, we call them. These are like ranches, small ranches, where are run by Indian government, so local government usually, and we bring there Israeli technologies for the farmers. We are not going to the top of the line because in India, like in Sri Lanka, many of the farmers are small farmers. They do not have the ability to invest what is needed for the really top of the line. But also at that level in India, we bring a lot of value to because we adjust the technology we bring to the needs and abilities of the farmer. So we are able to increase productivity in different fields, depends. In India, 3-4 timefolds. And I think the same has to be adopted here. There was an agreement already on creating a few centers of excellence in agriculture here in Sri Lanka. I think it did not come through because of the pandemic, because it was discussed around 2019. And then came the pandemic, and also the economic situation here was not bright because of the fall of tourism and everything. So there is an local investment needed because we bring the expertise, the planning and everything, but the local partner is the one that is setting up the place and making it run and bringing, by the way, in India, what millions of farmers already came to this place and many of them adopted the technology, and we are trying even, it's not Israelis, it's all Indian people, and that's what we hope to do in Sri Lanka, is to educate the educators. So help prepare a big layer, a serious layer of professionals to help educate the farmers and help them in the field also, not only in the centers of excellence. So we bring irrigation, semi-controlled environment of growth. We bring new seeds that are they have more yield. So it's a combination of things together that helps the farmer.
Well, actually, it's a proven fact that Israel has been pivotal and instrumental in supporting Sri Lankan agriculture. In fact, during the time of former President Jaya Jayawardena, we know that Israel played a key role in accelerating the Mahavali project, isn't it? And they were quick to implement various methods to relieve the country of the energy crisis, and also to settle farmers in the dry zones of Sri Lanka. And so it was done before, and it can be done again.
Yes, it was done. We try to, as I said, we always try to spread positivity wherever we can and be helpful. And we are ready to do that again. And we spoke to the Mahaval project people also as part of our discussions to see how it can be done. And probably the centers of excellence, partially at least, if not all of them, will be done with cooperation with them. Israel is also very advanced in arid zones because half of Israel is a desert and we grow in the desert. So we have agriculture in the desert. And again, it was done in the past. Unfortunately, the Israeli farm here stopped because of the severance of the diplomatic relations, but we want to come back in a different way, but want to come back to cooperation.
Well, that's great. What is the present status of the Israeli Business Development Office?
We don't have one here. So we have in Delhi in general, we have in India 3 that can help and be assistants. So but it's mainly the one in Delhi and in our embassy, which if there is a need, we have an honorary consul in Sri Lanka who is representing our interests, and through him or directly through our economical offices in Delhi, we can provide assistance and help to business people who want to come to Sri Lanka to invest, or the other way around, want to do business with Israel.
Actually, COVID hit the economies worldwide, and Sri Lanka is not immune to that hit. So, what specific areas or measures are in place currently to enhance economic and trade ties between Israel and Sri Lanka, or maybe even help Sri Lanka to develop economic ties with other countries?
Yeah, frankly, our trade is much too low. It's very low. It's in the, I think, last figure I saw around $30 million or something like that, which is not doesn't reflect anything. And we have to have, I think, efforts to increase it. I believe that if we start working with agriculture, maybe later with water, eventually it will bring also some more business cooperation. So I'm not sure it's only trade. It's also about Israeli investment. So if there will be opportunities here that are attractive enough, I'm sure that Israeli companies would come here. It can be in agriculture, it can be in water, it can be in clean energies, where Israeli companies are leaders in water desalinization. So the fields are enormous, but we have to create a comfortable environment for investors in general. I think it's important, and for the Israeli ones, once we start working on the projects, I hope it will also bring a little bit more. We also hope to bring tourism, which is very important because people have to know the place. Sri Lanka in the past was very popular with Israeli tourists, and we spoke here also to some ministers and to the chairman of your airline company about the need for direct flights. Today people, especially in the time of COVID, they don't want another airport. They need a direct flight. And this is crucial, I think, for tourism. Israelis are huge travelers because we are, in a sense, an island due to the fact that to most of our neighbors we cannot go and travel as tourists. So Israelis travel a lot, and I think if there would be direct flights, Sri Lanka has a lot to offer, really a lot to offer, and relatively the prices for the quality you get here are reasonable. So I think the potential is huge. Direct flights will help. Once Israelis come, things start evolving, and I hope it can also bring business.
Would you say that Sri Lanka is a dream destination?
I think it's a beautiful country. It has a lot to offer, from seaside to beautiful mountain sites and nature and archaeology and history. So I think you have the full package for the tourist.
Yes, we do.
And good food.
Oh, yes. Spicy but good.
Spicy.
Yeah. You did mention the Sri Lankans working in Israel. Now, there is a very high demand for jobs in Israel by Sri Lankans. Can Israel open its doors more and offer more job opportunities to Sri Lankans?
Yeah, well, we have an agreement that was signed a couple of years ago, which enabled the caregivers. So it has to go by sector. So for the time being, it's about caregivers. We have with other countries on agriculture, and I was asked whether we can do among us also on agricultural workers. The advantage in agricultural workers is that when they go and work in Israel, they do simple works, but they are exposed to different kind of agriculture. And some of them, when they go back to their home countries, they want to do the same there. So even if they don't know everything, they have the awareness that agriculture can be done also in different ways. And so we discussed it. It has to be an agreement between the countries at the end of the day. But we are very much open for caregivers as it is today, because Israel, being a very young country, is also a very aging country. So we are considered a relatively young population, especially for OECD countries. At the same time, the life expectancy is quite high. So we have aged people, and we are trying not to put them in institutions and stuff like that. So most families try to keep the parents at home, in their own home, and assist someone living with them and assisting them with life when it becomes a little bit too hard for them. So I think the potential is still growing. I think that in Israel, my impression is that there is content from the level of the Sri Lankan workers that have come, and I believe, at least I don't get any complaints, that also from the workers' side there is content on the attitude they get from their employers, which is very important, also for creating bonds between countries. You don't want people to go there and come back with a bad impression because they had a terrible employer, which happens sometimes in places.
So skilled labor as well as professionals?
Yes, yes, this is more or less.
And is there any system in place for, the education sector, so that when they finish basic education, does Israel offer any program that would help them to transit between school life and then work life?
Yeah, we don't at the current, not that I know of. What we do is we have vocational professional training that we do in fields. Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs has an agency called Mashav. It's the International Cooperation Agency, which does courses in different fields. It can be in agriculture, it can be in health, it can be in women empowerment, women entrepreneurship. So we have a huge variety of education, and we have Sri Lankans going there. So also, we have from quite many countries in the world. It's not open for all countries. It's open for specific countries, and Sri Lankan people are also invited and going there and part of it, but it's not in huge numbers because the cost is very high to bring someone and to have them study for a few weeks or few months, depends on the kind and of the course that they would take there, but we do offer such courses.
All right. How would you recap your visit to Sri Lanka this time?
I think that it was, first of all, a study visit. From my perspective, it's the first visit to understand a little bit about Sri Lanka, about the priorities, about what's happening, the situation here. But I came with my staff, we came with a very clear target, and these are the centers of excellence. Since it was a decision already taken and not implemented, this is our first priority. Go for the centers of excellence in agriculture to try and implement it and in a fast pace. And hopefully from here it will lead, once we start cooperating, working together, it can lead to many new avenues.
So where do you foresee Sri Lanka and Israel in the next couple of years?
In a better place when I got it. Always an ambassador comes to a place, he wants to hand it over to his successor after 3-4 years in a better state, better relations when they got it. So that's my hope.
Well, that's our hope too. And on that positive note, Your Excellency, we'd like to say thank you very much for joining us and for being our diplomatic face. And I think I'm correct, you'll be traveling out of the country today. So we'd like to wish you safe travel, and we hope to see you back in Sri Lanka very soon.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to come not only as a diplomat, also as a private person, because I want to do some exploring and tourism of the place. So.
Well, that's great. And we hope not only you, but even your family and your children can do the same. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Ayubowan. That was His Excellency Naor Gilon, Israeli ambassador to Sri Lanka, our diplomatic face for today. Well, thank you for joining us, and do join us next